Treated like a walking ATM, I pulled the plug. No check, no more control, forcing a reckoning that neither of them saw coming. The doorbell rang at exactly 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, cutting through the silence of my modest Lexington home like a knife through butter. I'd been sitting in my favorite armchair, reading the newspaper and enjoying a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 72, I treasured these quiet moments, especially since losing my dear wife Elena 5 years earlier to cancer. The postman handed me a thick cream-colored envelope, the kind that usually carried wedding invitations or important announcements. My heart skipped a beat when I recognized my son Kevin's precise handwriting on the front. After months of strained silence between us, I thought this might finally be the olive branch I'd been hoping for. You see, Kevin and I hadn't spoken properly in over a year. Our relationship had been deteriorating ever since Elena passed away. And frankly, I blamed myself for not being the father he needed during those difficult times. I'd thrown myself into work, trying to cope with grief, and Kevin had grown distant, climbing the corporate ladder in his tech career while I remained stuck in the past. I settled back into my chair, carefully opening the envelope with trembling fingers. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe this was his wedding invitation. Maybe he wanted me to walk him down the aisle like we used to joke about when he was younger. Maybe, just maybe, we could repair the damage that had been done to our relationship. But what I found inside wasn't an invitation at all. Instead, a stack of papers tumbled out onto my lap. Official-looking documents, itemized bills, and receipts. My eyes scanned the numbers, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. $50,000 for venue rental at some fancy estate. $20,000 for catering with imported wines and lobster flown in from Maine. $10,000 for a honeymoon suite in Hawaii with private beach access. The total at the bottom of the page made my blood run cold, $80,000. But it was the handwritten note attached to the bottom that really knocked the wind out of me. In Kevin's familiar scrawl, it read, "Dad, considering the problems you've caused our family, you should be grateful I'm allowing you to contribute to my wedding. This covers your portion. Send the check promptly. Victoria and I are counting on your support." I had to read it 3 times before the words sank in. Problems I'd caused, grateful to contribute. This wasn't a wedding invitation. This was a bill. My own son was billing me $80,000 for a wedding I apparently wasn't even invited to attend. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, being asked to pay for the most important day of my son's life, while simultaneously being told I wasn't welcome to witness it. The man I'd raised single-handedly after Elena's death, the boy I'd worked double shifts to put through college, was treating me like nothing more than a walking ATM. My hands shook as I set the papers down on the coffee table next to Elena's photograph. She smiled back at me from behind the glass, and I could almost hear her voice asking me what I was going to do about this situation. Elena always knew how to handle Kevin when he got too big for his britches, but she wasn't here anymore to guide me through this mess. I thought back to the last conversation Kevin and I had shared. It was Christmas morning, and I'd driven over to his downtown apartment with a tin of Elena's famous sugar cookies that I'd spent hours trying to recreate. Victoria had barely looked up from her phone when I arrived, and Kevin had seemed embarrassed by my presence. "Dad, we've talked about this," he'd said, not even inviting me to sit down. "Victoria's family has certain expectations about appearances and social status. Your lifestyle choices reflect on us now." Lifestyle choices. As if working as an engineer for 40 years and living modestly was somehow shameful. As if the small house Elena and I had shared for decades wasn't good enough for their sophisticated circle of friends. As if I was something to be hidden away and forgotten about until they needed money. And apparently, they needed quite a lot of money. I picked up the bills again, studying each line item with the analytical mind that had served me well in my engineering career. The venue alone cost more than I'd made in an entire year when Kevin was growing up. The catering budget exceeded what Elena and I had spent on groceries for the last 5 years of our marriage combined, and the honeymoon package was more expensive than the car I'd driven for the past decade. But what really bothered me wasn't the astronomical cost. It was the assumption that I would simply pay it without question, like some kind of silent partner in their fairy tale romance. The note made it clear that this wasn't a request or even a favor being asked of a loving father. This was a demand, dressed up with just enough guilt and manipulation to make me feel obligated to comply. I stood up from my chair and walked over to the kitchen window, looking out at the small garden Elena had planted years ago. The roses were blooming beautifully this time of year, their red petals reminding me of the corsage I'd bought for Elena on our first date. We'd been so young then, so full of hope and dreams for the future. We'd planned to grow old together, to watch our son get married, to spoil our grandchildren with love and homemade cookies. But life had other plans for us. Elena's illness had drained our savings account faster than a broken dam. The experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, the second opinions from specialists in other states, the medications that cost more per month than our mortgage payment. I'd sold my classic car, taken out a second mortgage on the house, and worked overtime every week for 2 years just to keep up with the medical bills. And through it all, Kevin had been notably absent. Oh, he'd visited the hospital a few times, usually when it was convenient for him or when Victoria needed to post photos on social media to show what a caring son-in-law she'd married. But when Elena was going through chemotherapy and needed someone to drive her to appointments, Kevin was too busy with work. When she was weak and scared and needed her family around her, Kevin was traveling for business conferences. I'd been the one holding Elena's hand when she took her last breath. I'd been the one making funeral arrangements while Kevin complained about having to take time off work. I'd been the one sitting alone in this house every night since, missing the woman I'd loved for 43 years, while Kevin moved on with his life as if nothing had happened. And now he wanted me to pay $80,000 for the privilege of not being invited to his wedding. I walked back to the coffee table and picked up Elena's photograph, tracing her face with my fingertip through the glass. She'd always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who could smooth over any argument or hurt feeling with her gentle wisdom and warm smile. But even Elena's patience had limits, and I knew she wouldn't have stood for this kind of treatment. "What should I do, sweetheart?" I whispered to her picture, half expecting to hear her voice answer back. But the house remained silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant sound of children playing in the neighborhood park. Normal sounds of a normal Tuesday afternoon in a normal life. Nothing about this situation felt normal to me. I sat back down and read through the bills one more time, noting details I'd missed in my initial shock. The wedding was scheduled for November 15th, just 6 weeks away. The venue was some exclusive estate outside of town that I'd never heard of, but apparently cost more per day than most people made in a month. The guest list included 200 people, none of whom would be me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Kevin was planning to celebrate the most important day of his life, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and Victoria's family, but his own father wasn't welcome to attend. I wasn't good enough to sit in their fancy chairs or eat their expensive food or witness my only child promise to love and honor another person for the rest of his life. But I was good enough to pay for it all. The anger started as a small flame in the pit of my stomach, growing stronger with each passing minute. This wasn't just about money or social status or wedding invitations. This was about respect. This was about family. This was about everything Elena and I had taught Kevin about love and loyalty and taking care of the people who matter most. Apparently, those lessons hadn't taken root. I folded the bills carefully and set them aside, then walked over to the desk where Elena used to pay our monthly expenses. Her reading glasses were still sitting there, waiting for her to return and balance the checkbook one more time. I opened the top drawer and pulled out our latest bank statement, running my finger down the columns of numbers. The money was there. Elena's life insurance policy, combined with my pension and the modest savings we'd managed to accumulate over the years, meant I could technically afford to pay Kevin's bill. It would wipe out most of my emergency fund and force me to live even more frugally than I already did. But it was possible. The question wasn't whether I could pay it. The question was whether I should. I spent the next hour pacing around my small living room, Elena's words echoing in my memory from years past. She used to say that sometimes the best way to teach someone a lesson was to let them face the consequences of their choices. At the time, she'd been talking about Kevin's tendency to procrastinate on school projects, but now those words carried a much deeper meaning. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't really about a wedding at all. This was about power. This was about Kevin believing he could manipulate me into funding his lifestyle while keeping me at arm's length when it suited him. This was about Victoria's influence over my son, turning him into someone I barely recognized anymore. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for my old friend Marcus, a retired lawyer who'd helped Elena and me with our wills years ago. If I was going to make a decision about this situation, I wanted to understand all my options first. Marcus, it's Stephen Torres, I said when he answered. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Stephen, good to hear from you, old friend. How are you holding up? I still think about Elena often. His genuine warmth reminded me why Elena had liked him so much. Marcus had been one of the few people who'd continued checking on me regularly after the funeral, bringing casseroles and staying for coffee when most others had moved on with their lives. I'm doing as well as can be expected, I replied. Actually, I'm calling because I need some advice about a family situation. It's complicated. I explained the wedding bill situation to Marcus, reading him the exact wording of Kevin's note and going through the itemized expenses line by line. He listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of disbelief as the numbers got higher. $80,000, he repeated when I finished. And you're not even invited to attend? That's right. Kevin says my presence would be inappropriate for their social circle. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the measured tone I remembered from his courtroom days. Stephen, from a legal standpoint, you have absolutely no obligation to pay for your son's wedding. A wedding is not a debt you inherit simply by being someone's parent. Even if Kevin had asked nicely, you'd be under no legal requirement to contribute a single penny. But what about morally? I asked. Am I being a bad father by refusing to help? That depends, Marcus said carefully. Are you refusing to help, or are you refusing to be taken advantage of? Because from where I sit, it sounds like Kevin is treating you like a bank rather than a father. His words hit home harder than I'd expected. That's exactly what this felt like. Not a son asking his father for help during a special time in his life, but a customer demanding payment from a service provider. Marcus, can I ask you something? If this were your son, what would you do? He chuckled softly. Stephen, if my son sent me a bill for $80,000 while simultaneously telling me I wasn't welcome at his wedding, I'd be tempted to frame that bill and hang it on my wall as a reminder of how not to raise children. After hanging up with Marcus, I felt somewhat clearer about my legal position, but emotionally, I was still torn. Part of me wanted to write the check just to avoid further conflict with Kevin, but another part of me, the part that sounded suspiciously like Elena's voice, whispered that sometimes love meant setting boundaries. I decided to take a drive to clear my head. The autumn afternoon was crisp and beautiful, with leaves turning brilliant shades of orange and red along the tree-lined streets of my neighborhood. I found myself driving toward the cemetery where Elena was buried, something I did whenever I needed her guidance the most. Her headstone was simple but elegant, just the way she would have wanted it. Elena Maria Torres, beloved wife and mother. I sat down on the small bench I'd installed nearby and told her about my day, about Kevin's bill, about feeling lost and alone and trying to figure out how to handle this situation. You always knew what to do when Kevin got out of line, I said aloud, not caring if anyone thought I was talking to myself. Remember when he was 16 and stole money from your purse to buy those expensive sneakers? You made him return the shoes and work extra chores for 2 months to pay back every penny. The memory made me smile despite my current predicament. Kevin had been furious at the time, claiming that all his friends had parents who just bought them whatever they wanted. But Elena had stood firm, explaining that respect and gratitude weren't optional in our family. He learned his lesson then, I continued, but somehow he's forgotten it as an adult. As I sat there in the peaceful silence of the cemetery, watching squirrels chase each other between the headstones, I began to see my situation more clearly. Kevin wasn't asking for help. He was demanding payment while offering nothing in return except the supposed privilege of funding his lifestyle. He wasn't treating me like family. He was treating me like an obligation. Elena had always believed that people would only treat you as badly as you allowed them to. For too long, I'd been allowing Kevin to treat me poorly, because I was afraid of losing what little relationship we had left. But maybe it was time to stop being afraid and start demanding the respect I deserved. I drove home with a growing sense of purpose, but I wasn't ready to make any hasty decisions. This situation had been building for years, and it deserved careful consideration. I spent the evening going through photo albums, looking at pictures of Kevin as a child, trying to remember when things had started to change between us. There he was at age 6, gap-toothed and grinning, wearing the baseball uniform I'd bought him for Little League. There he was at 10, proudly displaying the science fair project we'd worked on together for weeks. At 15, rolling his eyes but still hugging me after I'd embarrassed him by cheering too loudly at his graduation ceremony. When had that sweet, loving boy turned into the cold, calculating man who could send his father a bill for $80,000? The answer came to me as I flipped through photos from Kevin's college years. It was around the time he'd started dating Victoria, during his junior year at the University of Kentucky. She came from money, old Kentucky money that traced its roots back to thoroughbred racing and bourbon distilling. Her family lived in a mansion in the Highlands, drove luxury cars, and belonged to country clubs that charged more for monthly dues than I made in a quarter. At first, I'd been happy that Kevin had found someone who made him smile. Victoria was beautiful, intelligent, and seemed to genuinely care about my son. But gradually, I began to notice changes in Kevin's behavior. He started criticizing our modest lifestyle, making comments about how embarrassing our old furniture was when Victoria came to visit. He began distancing himself from his blue-collar roots, as if being the son of an engineer was something shameful. The final straw had come during Elena's illness. While I was juggling work, medical appointments, and caregiving duties, Kevin was notably absent. When I'd called him one particularly difficult day, begging him to come help me understand what the doctors were telling us about Elena's prognosis, he'd sighed heavily into the phone. "Dad, I can't keep taking time off work for every little medical update," he had said. "Victoria's family has invited us to spend the weekend at their lake house, and it's important for my career that I make a good impression." Every little medical update. His mother was dying, and he'd called it a little medical update. That's when I knew I'd lost my son to a world where appearance mattered more than love, where social status trumped family loyalty, where money could buy respect but couldn't purchase character. Now, sitting in my quiet living room with Kevin's bill spread across my coffee table, I realized that this wedding demand was just the latest chapter in a story that had been unfolding for years. Kevin and Victoria had been systematically pushing me out of their lives while keeping me around as a potential source of funding. They wanted my money, but not my presence, my financial support, but not my opinion, my sacrifice, but not my love. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Kevin's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I hesitated. Then I remembered Elena's words about consequences and picked up the phone. "Hello, Kevin." "Dad, thank God you answered. I was starting to worry you might not have gotten my package." His voice was cheerful, confident, as if he'd just sent me a birthday card instead of a bill for $80,000. The casual tone made my blood pressure spike. "Oh, I got it all right," I said carefully. "Quite a surprise. I know it seems like a lot, but you have to understand that Victoria's family has certain expectations. This wedding is going to be the social event of the season. Everyone who matters will be there." "Everyone who matters," I repeated, "and I assume that doesn't include me." There was a slight pause before Kevin answered, and I could almost hear him choosing his words carefully. "Dad, you know how these things work. Victoria's parents are very traditional, very concerned about appearances. Having you there would just be awkward. For everyone involved. Awkward for who, Kevin? Awkward for you to be seen with your father? Awkward for Victoria to admit that her husband comes from working-class stock?" "That's not what I meant," Kevin said, but his defensive tone suggested otherwise. "Look, this isn't about you personally. It's about maintaining certain social standards that are important for my career advancement." "Your career advancement." I felt that familiar flame of anger starting to grow in my chest again. "Tell me something, son. When exactly did I become an embarrassment to you?" "You're being dramatic, Dad. This is just business. The wedding is an investment in our future, and frankly, your contribution is the least you can do after everything." "After everything?" My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. "What exactly is this everything you're referring to?" Come on, Dad. Don't pretend you don't know. The way you handled Mom's illness, retreating into yourself instead of fighting harder. The way you've let yourself go since she died, living in that tiny house, driving that old car. You've given up on life, and it reflects poorly on our family name. His words hit me like physical blows, each accusation more painful than the last. This was my son, the boy I'd raised alone for the last 5 years of his mother's life, telling me that my grief was an embarrassment to him. I see, I said quietly. So in your mind, I'm responsible for your mother's death, and my mourning period has lasted too long for your social calendar. I didn't say that, Kevin backpedaled, but the damage was already done. You didn't need to say it directly. The message is clear enough. I took a deep breath, feeling Elena's strength flowing through me. Kevin, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. I'm listening, Kevin said, though his tone suggested he was already preparing his next argument. I will not be sending you $80,000 for your wedding, not one penny of it. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, each second stretching between us like a canyon. What do you mean you won't send it? Kevin's voice had lost its confident edge, replaced by something sharper, more desperate. Dad, we're counting on this money. The deposits are due next week. Then I suggest you figure out another way to pay for your fairy tale wedding, I replied, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. Maybe Victoria's family, with all their traditional values and social expectations, can foot the bill for their daughter's special day. You can't be serious, Kevin sputtered. This is my wedding we're talking about, your only son's wedding. The same wedding I'm not invited to attend, I reminded him. The same wedding where my presence would be awkward and embarrassing to you and your sophisticated friends. I could hear muffled voices in the background, probably Victoria coaching him on what to say next. When Kevin spoke again, his tone had shifted to something that might have been intended as apologetic. Look, Dad, maybe we can work something out about the guest list. If the money comes through quickly enough, perhaps we could find a way to include you in some capacity. Some capacity, I repeated slowly. Like what, Kevin? Parking cars, serving drinks, hiding in the kitchen until the important people leave? That's not what I meant. Yes, it is exactly what you meant. The anger I'd been holding back finally broke through. You want me to pay for the privilege of being treated like hired help at my own son's wedding? You want my money but not my presence, my sacrifice but not my love. Dad, please, you're being unreasonable. This is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Victoria's family expects certain standards. Victoria's family, I cut him off. Tell me something, Kevin. When did Victoria's family become more important to you than your own father? When did their approval matter more than the man who raised you? It's not about approval. It's about respect, Kevin shot back. Victoria's father is a successful businessman. Her mother sits on charity boards. They move in circles where image matters, where connections can make or break a career. You wouldn't understand. You're right, I said quietly. I wouldn't understand how someone could be so shallow that they'd judge a man by his bank account, rather than his character. Your mother and I obviously failed to teach you that lesson. Don't bring Mom into this, Kevin's voice cracked slightly. She would have wanted me to be successful, to marry well, to make something of myself. Your mother would have been ashamed of the man you've become, I said, and immediately regretted the harshness of those words. But they were out now, hanging between us like a sword. The silence stretched again, longer this time. When Kevin spoke, his voice was cold as winter steel. Fine, if that's how you want to play this, then we're done. Don't expect any more calls from me. Don't expect wedding photos or updates about our life. And don't expect to ever meet your grandchildren when they come along. The threat of being cut off from future grandchildren hit me harder than I'd expected, but I forced myself to stay strong. Kevin, if you want to use emotional blackmail and threats to get money from me, then maybe we were already done, long before this conversation started. This isn't blackmail, it's consequences, he replied. You're choosing money over family, Dad. I hope $80,000 is worth losing your only son. The irony of his accusation was almost laughable. He was the one demanding money while simultaneously rejecting me, yet somehow I was the one choosing money over family. Goodbye, Kevin, I said softly, and hung up the phone. The house fell silent except for that persistent ticking of the grandfather clock. I sat in my armchair, staring at Elena's photograph, waiting to feel regret or doubt about what I'd just done. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: relief. For too long, I'd been walking on eggshells around Kevin, afraid to upset him, afraid to lose what little connection we had left. I'd allowed him to treat me poorly because I was terrified of being alone. But now that the worst had happened, now that he'd finally said out loud what I'd suspected for years, that I was an embarrassment to him, I felt strangely liberated. The phone rang again 20 minutes later. This time it was Victoria, her voice sickeningly sweet in that way that meant she was about to ask for something. "Stephen, it's Victoria. I think there may have been a misunderstanding with Kevin." "No misunderstanding," I replied calmly. "I understood perfectly. You want my money, but not my company." "Oh, Stephen, that's not true at all. You know how much we both love and respect you. Kevin was just stressed about the wedding planning. You know how men get when they're overwhelmed." Her patronizing tone made my skin crawl, but I kept my voice level. "Victoria, let me ask you something directly. If I wrote you a check for $80,000 tomorrow, would I be invited to your wedding?" Another pause, shorter this time, but telling. "Well, that would certainly change the dynamic," she said carefully. "With your generous contribution, I'm sure we could make arrangements." "Make arrangements," I repeated. "Not, of course, you'd be invited as Kevin's father, but we could make arrangements. Do you hear yourself, Victoria? Do you understand what you're actually saying?" "Stephen, I think you're misinterpreting." "I'm not misinterpreting anything. You're telling me that my invitation to my own son's wedding is contingent upon my financial contribution. You're treating me like a vendor, not family." That's not fair." Victoria's sweet facade was starting to crack. "We're trying to build a life together, and weddings are expensive. Kevin's father should want to help with that." "Kevin's father should be honored to help with his son's wedding," I agreed. "But Kevin's father should also be honored with an invitation that doesn't depend on the size of his check." "Sir." "Look, Stephen, let's be practical here. The truth is, you and our social circle don't exactly mesh. It's nothing personal, it's just that you might feel uncomfortable at an event like this." There it was, the truth finally spoken aloud. I wasn't good enough for their social circle. My 40 years of honest work, my faithful marriage, my dedication to raising my son, none of that mattered because I didn't have the right pedigree or the right bank account. "You're absolutely right, Victoria," I said, surprising her with my agreement. "I would be very uncomfortable at an event where people judge others based on their social status rather than their character. I would be uncomfortable around people who think money can buy respect. I would be uncomfortable watching my son pretend to be someone he's not just to impress people who don't really care about him." "Stephen, please." "No, Victoria. You've made your position clear. You want my money, but not my presence. You want my sacrifice, but not my love. You want me to pay for a party I'm not welcome to attend. The answer is no." "Fine," she snapped, her sweet mask finally falling away completely. "But don't come crying to us when you're sitting alone in that pathetic little house, wondering why your son doesn't call anymore. This is your choice, Stephen. You're choosing pride over family." "Actually, Victoria, I'm choosing dignity over manipulation. There's a difference." I hung up before she could respond, then immediately unplugged the phone from the wall. I had a feeling there would be more calls tonight, and I wasn't interested in hearing any more threats or guilt trips. Instead, I made myself a simple dinner: grilled cheese and tomato soup, Elena's favorite comfort meal, and sat at the kitchen table thinking about what had just happened. In the span of one afternoon, I'd essentially severed my relationship with my only child. It should have felt devastating. Instead, it felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for years. The truth was, I'd been losing Kevin gradually for a long time. This wedding bill had just forced the issue into the open, made us both acknowledge what had been building between us since Elena's death. Maybe even longer than that. I thought about the boy Kevin used to be, before Victoria's influence, before his obsession with social climbing. He'd been kind then, generous with his laughter, quick to help neighbors with their yard work, or elderly Mrs. Henderson with her groceries. He'd inherited Elena's compassionate heart and her sense of fairness. But somewhere along the way, that boy had been replaced by a man who valued appearances over authenticity, who saw relationships as transactions, who could look his own father in the eye and demand payment for the privilege of being excluded. As I washed my dinner dishes, I made a decision that surprised even me. Tomorrow I was going to do something I hadn't done in years. I was going to start living for myself instead of trying to please a son who clearly had no respect for me. I pulled out a notepad and started making a list of things I'd been putting off, things I'd wanted to do but had always found excuses to avoid. Learn to paint watercolors like Elena had always encouraged me to do. Take that trip to Ireland we'd planned before she got sick. Volunteer at the animal shelter where Elena used to help out on weekends. Join the community center's senior hiking group that had been sending me invitations for months. For years, I'd been living in a kind of suspended animation, waiting for Kevin to need me, waiting for our relationship to heal, waiting for him to remember that he had a father who loved him. But I was done waiting. If Kevin wanted to write me out of his life, that was his choice. But I wasn't going to spend my remaining years sitting in this house, mourning relationships that had already died. Elena wouldn't have wanted that for me, and somewhere deep in my heart, I knew the boy Kevin used to be wouldn't have wanted it either. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. After my morning coffee, I drove to the bank and met with my financial advisor, a kind woman named Patricia, who'd been helping me manage Elena's life insurance money. I want to set up a travel fund, I told her, and maybe look into some investments that could generate income for charitable giving. Patricia smiled as she pulled out the paperwork. It sounds like you're ready to start a new chapter, Mr. Torres. Something like that, I agreed, thinking about the $80,000 bill sitting on my kitchen table at home. Kevin and Victoria thought I was selfish for keeping my money to myself. They had no idea that I was actually planning to give most of it away, just not to them. That afternoon, I called my old friend Marcus again and asked him about setting up a scholarship fund in Elena's memory. Something for first-generation college students who needed help but didn't have wealthy parents to fall back on. Students like Kevin had been once before he'd forgotten where he came from. It's a beautiful way to honor Elena's memory, Marcus said warmly. She always believed in education as a path to a better life. She did, I agreed. And she would have loved knowing that her life insurance money was helping other young people achieve their dreams, instead of funding someone's overpriced party. I spent the evening researching scholarship programs and charitable organizations, feeling more energized than I had in months. This felt right. This felt like something Elena would approve of, something that would make a real difference in people's lives. Around 9 o'clock, as I was reading about a program that helped military veterans attend college, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw Kevin standing on my front porch, his shoulders hunched against the evening chill. For a moment, I considered not answering. We'd said everything that needed to be said during our phone conversation, but something in his posture, the way he was holding himself, reminded me of the little boy who used to come to me when he was scared or hurt. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Hello, Kevin." He looked older than his 32 years, stress lines creasing his face, his usually perfect hair disheveled. "Dad, we need to talk. I think we said everything yesterday." "Please," he said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard in years. Vulnerability. "Just give me 5 minutes, please." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and led him into the living room. He sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, while I remained standing by the window. "The wedding's off," he said quietly. I felt a mix of emotions, surprise, concern, and if I was being honest, a small measure of satisfaction. "What happened?" "Victoria's parents pulled their funding when they found out you weren't contributing. Apparently, your refusal to pay was seen as a sign of family instability. Bad optics, they called it." Kevin laughed bitterly. "Turns out their support was just as conditional as they thought yours should be. When they realized the Torres family wasn't going to be a reliable source of funding for Victoria's lifestyle, they suddenly developed concerns about our compatibility. I wanted to feel sorry for him, but mostly I felt tired." "I'm sorry to hear that, Kevin." "Are you?" He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Because part of me thinks you planned this somehow. Part of me thinks you wanted to ruin my wedding." The accusation stung, but I kept my voice calm. "Kevin, I didn't ruin your wedding. You did. The moment you decided to exclude your father while demanding he pay for your party. You ruined it when you chose Victoria's family's approval over your own father's love." He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know how we got here, Dad. I don't know when everything got so complicated between us. It got complicated when you decided I wasn't good enough for your new life, I replied. It got complicated when you started seeing me as an obligation rather than your father. That's not, he started to protest, then stopped. Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been treating you badly. Maybe? He winced. I've been treating you badly. I know that. Victoria's family, their expectations, their lifestyle, it all seemed so important. I thought if I could just fit in with them, if I could prove I belonged in their world, then everything would be better. Better for who, Kevin? Better for you? Because it certainly hasn't been better for our relationship. I know. He rubbed his face with both hands. I know I've been a terrible son, especially after Mom died. I should have been there for you, should have helped more with her care, should have stayed in touch better afterwards. Instead, I blamed you for things that weren't your fault and pulled away when you needed me most. His admission caught me off guard. I'd been preparing for more manipulation, more demands, more threats. I hadn't expected genuine remorse. Why are you telling me this now, Kevin? Is it because the wedding fell through? Because Victoria's family rejected you? Would you be here apologizing if everything had gone according to your plan? He was quiet again, considering the question. I don't know, he said finally. Maybe not. Maybe it took losing everything to make me realize what I'd already lost. What do you mean? I mean you, Dad. I lost you years ago and I was too proud and too stupid to realize it until now. Victoria's gone back to her parents. The wedding's off. My job's in jeopardy because her father has connections at my company. And all I can think about is how I don't have anyone to call, anyone who actually gives a damn about me, rather than what I can do for them. And you think I'm that person? I asked. After everything you've said and done, you think you can just show up here and I'll welcome you back with open arms? No, he said, shaking his head. I don't think that. I hope for it, but I don't expect it. I know I've burned bridges that might not be repairable. I know I've said things that can't be taken back. But I had to try, Dad. I had to come here and tell you that I'm sorry, and that I love you, and that I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. But all I saw was exhaustion and genuine regret. This wasn't the confident, dismissive man who'd sent me a bill for $80,000. This was someone who'd been humbled by circumstances, forced to confront the consequences of his choices. Kevin, I said slowly, I need you to understand something. Even if I forgive you, even if we somehow manage to repair our relationship, things can't go back to the way they were. Too much has happened. Too many hurtful things have been said. I understand, he nodded. I'm not asking for things to go back to the way they were. I'm asking for a chance to build something new, something better, something based on respect instead of obligation. I walked over to the mantel and picked up Elena's photograph, running my thumb along the frame as I'd done so many times before. Your mother always believed people could change, I said quietly. She believed in second chances, in forgiveness, in the power of love to heal broken relationships. She was a better person than either of us, Kevin said. Yes, she was. But she also believed that forgiveness had to be earned, not just requested. She believed that actions mattered more than words, that saying you're sorry wasn't enough if you weren't willing to do the work to make things right. Kevin stood up from the couch, hope flickering in his eyes. Tell me what I need to do, Dad. Tell me how to make this right. I set Elena's picture back on the mantel and turned to face my son. For the first time in years, I saw not the cold, calculating man he'd become, but glimpses of the boy I'd raised, the boy who'd once believed his father could fix anything. That's not for me to tell you, Kevin. That's for you to figure out. But I will say this. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be based on genuine respect and affection, not convenience or guilt or obligation. I won't be treated like a backup plan anymore. I understand, he said. And Dad, I really am sorry. Not just about the wedding bill, but about everything. About Mom's illness, about the years of distance, about making you feel like you weren't good enough for my life. You deserved so much better from me. As he walked toward the door, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the beginning of a possibility. Maybe Elena had been right about second chances after all. Kevin, I called out as he reached for the doorknob. He turned back, waiting. If you're serious about making things right, if you really want to rebuild our relationship, then start by showing me through your actions, not your words. Don't tell me you're sorry. Show me you're sorry. How do I do that? That's for you to figure out, I repeated. But Kevin, don't do it for me. Do it because you want to become the kind of man your mother raised you to be. Do it because you want to be able to look at yourself in the mirror and feel proud of who you see. He nodded slowly, understanding passing between us for the first time in years. I'll try, Dad. I promise I'll try. After he left, I sat back down in my armchair and looked around my quiet living room. The wedding bill was still sitting on the coffee table, but it no longer felt like a weapon pointed at my heart. Instead, it felt like evidence of a chapter that was finally closing, making room for whatever came next. I didn't know if Kevin would follow through on his promise, but I decided to give him space to figure things out on his own. The next few weeks passed quietly, with no phone calls or surprise visits. I used the time to start implementing some of the changes I'd been thinking about since that fateful day when the wedding bill arrived. My first stop was the local animal shelter where Elena used to volunteer. The director, a kind woman named Sarah, remembered both of us fondly and welcomed me with open arms. Within days, I was spending my mornings walking dogs and helping with adoption events. The simple joy of caring for abandoned animals gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I also enrolled in that watercolor painting class Elena had always encouraged me to try. Turns out I had absolutely no natural talent for it, but there was something meditative about mixing colors and trying to capture the light filtering through leaves. My instructor, a patient woman in her 70s, assured me that artistic skill wasn't the point. The process itself was what mattered. 3 weeks after Kevin's visit, I was in my garden pruning Elena's roses when I heard a car pull into my driveway. I looked up to see a modest sedan I didn't recognize. Kevin got out of the driver's side, wearing jeans and an old sweater instead of his usual expensive suits. Dad, he said, approaching cautiously, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. It's your choice to make, I replied, continuing my work with the pruning shears. He stood there for a moment, clearly nervous. I wanted to tell you some things that have been happening, changes I've been making. I looked up at him, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way his clothes hung loose on his frame. You look like you've lost weight. Yeah, well, stress will do that. He managed a weak smile. I've been doing a lot of thinking since we talked. About Mom, about you, about the kind of person I've become. I set down my gardening tools and gave him my full attention. And what conclusions have you reached? That I don't like who I am anymore, he said simply. That somewhere along the way, I lost sight of everything you and Mom taught me about what really matters in life. We walked over to the small bench I'd placed near Elena's rose garden, sitting down side by side like we used to when he was young and troubled about something at school. I broke up with Victoria, he said quietly. Actually, that's not accurate. She broke up with me when her parents made it clear they wouldn't support our relationship anymore. But honestly, I was relieved. Relieved? I realized I was exhausted from trying to be someone I'm not, from constantly worrying about appearances and status and what other people thought of me. I was losing myself trying to fit into their world. I nodded but didn't respond, letting him continue at his own pace. I've been going to therapy, he said, glancing at me sideways as if expecting judgment. Individual counseling, twice a week. My therapist says I have issues with self-worth that I've been trying to solve by seeking validation from the wrong people. And what do you think about that assessment? Kevin was quiet for a long moment, watching a cardinal land on one of Elena's rose bushes. I think she's right. I think I've been so afraid of being ordinary, of being just another middle-class guy with a regular job, that I convinced myself I needed to be someone special, someone important. You are someone special, Kevin, I said softly. You always have been, but not because of your job title or your bank account or who you're married to. You're special because you're my son, because you have Elena's kind heart buried somewhere under all that ambition. His eyes filled with tears. I don't know if I do anymore, Dad. I think I might have lost that part of myself. Nothing's ever truly lost, I replied, thinking of Elena's favorite saying. Sometimes it just gets buried under other things and you have to dig to find it again. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the afternoon light play across Elena's carefully tended garden. Finally, Kevin spoke again. "I quit my job," he said. "Well, technically I was laid off, but I didn't fight it. Victoria's father made some calls, had me blacklisted from most of the major tech firms in the area. Instead of panicking about it, I realized it was an opportunity." "An opportunity for what?" "To figure out what I actually want to do with my life, instead of what I thought would impress other people." He turned to face me. "Do you remember when I was 12 and I wanted to be a teacher? You and Mom encouraged me, said I'd be great with kids because I was so patient with my younger cousins." I smiled at the memory. "You used to set up a classroom in the basement and make your stuffed animals sit through math lessons." I'd forgotten about that until recently. My therapist asked me to think about times when I felt truly happy, truly myself, and that memory came flooding back. The joy I felt when I was helping someone understand something new, the satisfaction of seeing that moment when everything clicked for them. "Are you thinking about going back to school?" "I'm thinking about a lot of things," he said. "Maybe teaching, maybe counseling, maybe something completely different. The point is, I want to do something that feels meaningful instead of just lucrative." As we talked, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine pride in my son. Not pride in his achievements or his status, but pride in his character, in his willingness to examine his life and make difficult changes. "There's something else I want to tell you," Kevin said, his voice growing serious. "I've been going through my finances, trying to figure out how to rebuild my life on a more modest scale. When I was doing that, I realized how much money you must have spent on me over the years." I started to protest, but he held up his hand. "Please, let me say this. College tuition, the down payment on my first apartment, all those times I called asking for help with bills or car repairs or emergency expenses. I never kept track because I just assumed it was your job as my father to help me. But when I started adding it up," he pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pocket, covered with neat handwriting and calculations. "Dad, I estimate that over the past 10 years, you've given me close to $150,000, maybe more. And I never once thanked you properly or acknowledged the sacrifice that must have represented." The number was probably accurate, maybe even conservative. But hearing him say it, seeing the genuine remorse in his eyes, meant more to me than any amount of money. "Kevin, that's what parents do for their children. You don't owe me." "But I do owe you," he interrupted. "Not the money necessarily, though I hope to pay back what I can someday. I owe you respect. I owe you gratitude. I owe you the kind of relationship where I value your presence in my life instead of just your financial support." We sat there as the sun began to set, painting Elena's roses in shades of gold and pink. I thought about the man sitting next to me, trying to reconcile this thoughtful, humble person with the cold stranger who had sent me that wedding bill just weeks earlier. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you got that bill from me, when you realized I'd banned you from the wedding but still expected you to pay for it, what was your first reaction? Anger? Hurt?" I considered the question carefully. "Both, I think. But mostly disappointment. Disappointment that I'd somehow failed to teach you the difference between love and money, between family and transactions." Kevin winced. "You didn't fail to teach me. I failed to remember the lessons." As darkness began to fall, Kevin stood up to leave. But before he walked away, he turned back to me one more time. "Dad, I know I have a lot of work to do to earn your trust back. I know saying sorry isn't enough, but I want you to know that I'm committed to doing that work, even if it takes years." "What does that look like to you?" I asked. "Had prit." "It looks like showing up, not just when I need something, but because I want to spend time with you. It looks like including you in my life decisions, asking for your advice, not because I need money, but because I value your wisdom. It looks like building the kind of relationship Mom would have been proud of." After he left, I sat on the bench until full darkness fell, listening to the crickets sing in Elena's garden. For the first time since receiving that wedding bill, I felt something like hope blooming in my chest. Over the following months, Kevin proved true to his word. He started calling regularly, not to ask for money, but just to check in, to share stories about his job search, to ask my opinion on decisions big and small. He helped me install new gutters on the house, accompanied me to doctor's appointments, and even joined me for watercolor painting classes, where he proved to be almost as terrible at art as I was. The most meaningful change came when he started volunteering at the animal shelter with me. Watching him gentle a frightened dog or patiently help a family choose the right pet, I saw glimpses of the compassionate boy Elena and I had raised. That boy hadn't disappeared after all. He'd just been buried under years of misplaced priorities. 6 months after the wedding that never happened, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible when I first received Kevin's bill. I called him and asked if he'd like to help me plan a memorial service for Elena's birthday, something we'd never done because we'd been too wrapped up in our own grief and resentment to honor her memory properly. "I'd love that, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think Mom would have liked that too." As we planned the small gathering, just a few close friends and neighbors, some of Elena's favorite foods, stories, and pictures celebrating her life, I realized that something beautiful had grown from the ashes of our broken relationship. We weren't the same father and son we'd been before, but maybe we were something better. Something more honest, more intentional, more grateful for what we had, instead of resentful about what we'd lost. The memorial service was perfect in its simplicity. Kevin gave a speech about Elena's influence on his life, acknowledging how he'd lost his way after her death, but was finding his path back to the values she'd taught him. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Later, as we cleaned up together, Kevin paused in his work and looked at me seriously. "Dad, I need to tell you something. That $80,000 wedding bill, it was the best thing that ever happened to me." I raised an eyebrow. "How do you figure?" Because it forced me to face the truth about who I'd become. It made me realize that I was treating the people I loved like resources instead of relationships. If you had just written that check, if you'd enabled my behavior one more time, I might never have learned this lesson. And what lesson is that? That love isn't something you buy or sell. It's something you give freely, without conditions, without expecting anything in return. That's how you loved me, even when I didn't deserve it. That's how Mom loved both of us. And that's how I want to love the people in my life going forward. As I looked at my son, really looked at him perhaps for the first time in years, I saw Elena's eyes staring back at me, full of warmth and wisdom and hope for the future. Maybe second chances were real after all. Maybe love really could heal broken relationships, given enough time and effort and genuine remorse. The wedding bill still sits in my desk drawer, not as a reminder of hurt, but as a testament to the power of standing up for yourself, of demanding the respect you deserve, and of believing that people can change when they're ready to do the hard work of becoming better. Kevin never did pay me back that $80,000, and I never expected him to. What he gave me instead was something far more valuable. A son who values my presence over my presence, who seeks my company rather than my cash, and who understands that the greatest gift a parent can give isn't money at all. It's love, freely given and gratefully received, no strings attached.